development here, which has kind of, what does it mean? But certainly we know that it's no longer the same society that we had before. No longer the same society we had before. What is the variety of methods deployed? Largely defined to dialogue, prejudice reduction, adult education, residential work. If you like, the caricature of community relations work is in 1990. Policy development and implementation, integration into strategic planning, organisational management, partnerships, direct intervention, interface communication, art, sports, media, conference, seminar, events, campaigns, public, blah, blah, blah. You can see that what you have now, again, is a highly sophisticated infrastructure. What issues are directly addressed? Where does community relations work take place? It used to be you had neutral venues, no publicity allowed, go to Cornwall, go to the universities. Now you can have across every district council on or near interfaces, in minority ethnic centres, in town hall, art centres, street events, community venues reaching from Ticola and Armagh to probably the Ballycastles and Collins Park House in Derry to the Clinton Centre in Enniskillen, in single identity and shared venues everywhere. No longer true. And how does its policy impact is now a serious issue with the CRC. But here is the fundamental question, which is, in 2007, the power was devolved. And the critical question, I suppose, is the second half of the slide, which is that at that time, what had evolved was a fairly clear, internationally driven, you find it in all the funding programs in the P3 program, a process of reconciliation, which was understood by this: shared vision of an interdependent society, acknowledged duty with the past, building toxic relationship, significant cultural and attitudinal change, and a commitment to deal with the inequities questions. What is difficult to ascertain after 2007 is any governmental priority given to any of those things. Actually, that shared vision of an interdependent society has proved almost impossible to create. That acknowledgement and dealing with the past is the one thing that we absolutely cannot do. That building positive relationships is not a priority and is not to be in terms of intercommunity relationships. Significant cultural and attitudinal change, possibly some evidence, but still no movement on parading and on the core issues that are around shared space that creates, and profound difficulty still around serious equity questions. Whether we've dealt with it in Girdwood, that might be an interesting question. What is absolutely clear is what looks like a steam train, what I've tried to describe it as a steam train moving forward in terms of international support. When it starts to rely on domestic support, it seems to collapse. But the buy-in and the evidence is not there. And at some level, the core thing is containment. Let's contain this problem. What is required for the middle classes is not some visionary statement which is driven internationally, but it's in fact peace is the absence of violence. That there is a unwillingness to engage with external ideas, that the core goal is to keep this tight, and the critical task is the consolidation of power. And the very big question to be answered now is, have we as a society effectively built up something which was built up in terms of practice and pilot, but which didn't have any buyers? Didn't have any buyers. That's the interesting question. At one level or other, I want to make an unpopular argument. I want to say that when you ask about the progress of this issue, if you look at 1990 and how weak this issue was, this has become totally and absolutely mainstream language. Purely political means was absolutely a CRC activity in the equality, human rights and good relations as core issues. Reconciliation as a core goal. Shared future as a core goal. Equity, diversity and independence as core issues. Anti-sectarianism as named. Power sharing as key. Dialogue is important. Bridging social capital is important. And hugely sophisticated practice and project terms. But I have to say that if you were looking at failings of this issue, you would have to say that at the same level, in the question of consociation versus reconciliation, we seem to eventually decide that if the worst aspects of the costs of these structures are dealt with in behaviours and attitudes, then we don't which is that efforts to move this to transformation of society rather than simply a truce will actually undermine the truce, so that these things are not met as way stations in a direction, they're actually alternatives. Sectarianism is an activity, not a structural legacy, so we no longer have to tackle structural legacy, we simply have to stop the activity. So, funnily enough, the drive is to go back down to supporting small-scale local projects rather than to dealing with serious policy-related activity. It's nobody's aspiration, but it's everybody's predicament. So it's caught in being always feeling like have to do rather than want to do. It's reliant entirely on projects where the money's going out. The measurable benefits of this are disputed, and the argument from urgency appears to disappear. Human rights and equality, rather than being co-consequences of the same activity, are set against it. And the question of the failure of mainstreaming and of measuring progress and of who's responsible and what has been done remains at least begs. So, I have so much more material here about, looking at impact, about what happens. I don't want to, I really can't bore you anymore, it's not fair. The point, I suppose, of this is, looking at progress, failure and failure, is that what is certainly true is that an antagonistic society is one in which revenge seems like the normative act. It's very hard to distinguish from the normative acts of justice. The point of reconciliation is this visionary-driven activity, which is that at some level or other, this antagonism is created, but is changed by some other type of conversation, which is characterized by those 5 aspects. The question is, if we have neither, have we come to a position which actually is closer to the next 2, which is that you have residual resentment, which presents a potential, if not actual, threat at some level to the stability of the society, which remains fundamentally antagonistic. And after all that effort for 20 years, with all the money disappearing and all the other discussions, do we essentially return to a type of resignation around this issue, which simply treats that as normative? Now, my own view of this is that that is why the discussion around what we're going to do with the shared future strategy actually really matters, because a set of decisions have to be taken about resources and about priorities, and also about what the content of that looks like. That's the drum that can be banged on another day. I simply want to put it to you that the notion of community relations is a static activity and did not have a massive impact on the society, is simply untenable from the evidence. But that the question of how it engages with politics and how it creatively engages with the question of its good to stop the violence is now the question which will determine what happens in the society as we go forward.